After owning this race car for almost 2 years, I finally got the chance to take it out on track for the first time. And for a moment, it was exhilarating. But only 1.5 laps in, a mechanical failure, which caused the end of my day. In this video, I'll tell you exactly what happened on the car's first shakedown. Obviously, my first time out in this car was hugely disappointing, but you know what? It really could have been worse. For the short time it lasted, it was incredible, and I'm still grateful that I finally got to drive the car. Anyway, let's start this story with the final preparations before going on track. In the last video, I finished the custom foam seat that matched me and the car, but there were still a few things to do, and Andy was kind enough to come around and help me work through that list, as well as other items that we added. Some of these jobs were simple but time-consuming, like making sure all of the bolts around the car were tight. We also did things like reinstalling the fuel filler, installing a tow strap at the rear, installing, adjusting and tightening up the top harnesses, and installing safety stickers around the car where required by the regulations. The only thing not ticked off my list was installing the AIM Solo 2. This is a lap timer and data logger that runs completely off GPS. When you get to the track, you turn it on, it identifies the track you're at, and as you start driving, it will automatically start and stop lap timing and display your best lap delta. At this stage, I just went for the simplest installation that I could. In the following days, I designed and 3D printed some more tidbits, like this magnetic side harness holder. It basically stops the buckles from falling down and getting in the way as you get in and out of the car. I've also got this Anderson charging plug in parallel with the battery. I didn't want that flapping about, so I made another TPU piece that it plugs into to hold it still when driving. I also connected to the car's electronics so I could see what warning was what for the LEDs on the steering wheel. So that's as much as I could do to prepare the car, but what about preparing for the actual track? I'd chosen Luddenham Raceway for my shakedown. This is one of the closest tracks to me, only about 40 minutes away, and it's very tight, twisty and short at only 1.4 kilometers. I figured a midweek session would be cheaper and quieter than a bigger racetrack like Sydney Motorsport Park, also known as Eastern Creek. Fortunately for me, in Assetto Corsa, there's an excellently detailed model of this by Benjamin McHale. Now I don't have my own car to use in Assetto Corsa, so I rotate between a few open wheelers like this Formula RSS4 by Race Sim Studio. The pace shouldn't be too different, and at a glance it looks quite a lot like my car. Let me take you for a very quick virtual lap of this circuit. The start-finish straight is very short, only a few hundred meters. Turn 1 is blind over a crest, medium speed right-hander, and then immediately we go downhill to a tight right-hand hairpin, the first of several of these turns. As we exit that, we have a very short straight, if you can even call it that goes into a left-hand hairpin. After this, the track briefly opens up, and we have another medium speed right-hander, probably the fastest corner on the circuit. We have a dip down and then back up for a medium speed right-hand hairpin. This one seems to last forever, but then immediately switches back to a much tighter left-hand hairpin. We have a small uphill section, followed by another right-hand hairpin, which then opens up onto the start-finish straight. That lap was around 45 seconds, but there's no fear in the sim rig. Also, the car's not an exact match. The main part of my preparation wasn't to work out how fast to go, but more were to work out the places where an off would have the most consequence. And I wasn't really worried about any of those hairpins because they were so low speed. I figured the riskiest corner was turn 1, as you need to do your braking before the crest, because if you leave it too late and transfer the weight to the front, you'll probably lose the rear and fly off into the grass. At least there was a good amount of runoff there. The other corner I was worried about was that medium speed right-hander in the first half of the lap. The thing about it is that it actually tightens right at the end, so it might seem like you can take it fairly fast at the start, but if you run wide on exit, you're going to be on the grass and then you're going to lose control very quickly. A quick word about that dam in the middle. Apparently, if an EV runs at the track and catches on fire, the official policy is to tow it into the dam to stop the fire from spreading any further. That was more prep done, so let's fast forward to the actual track day. I arrived at the track at 7:30 on the dot, and that was early enough to get one of the undercover pit spots. Andy was once again kind enough to take the day off work and be my support crew. My mum also came along to cheer me. Matt and Dave were at work, but Dave let us take his knob, so at least an important part of him was there. The vast majority of the cars there were road registered, or at least road based. The only ones that weren't were myself, this Caterham, and an Aussie racing car. The participants were split into 4 different groups, and I opted to go in intermediate, which was the second lowest of those available. Before anything happened on track, there was the safety briefing, followed by some brief scrutineering. The only thing they wanted for my car was to put on this flag so it could be seen over the top of the concrete barriers. As the minutes counted down, I changed into my full race gear and did the final prep on the car with Andy. That included turning on the cameras and the GPS gear, starting the engine to let it warm up, and then jacking up the rear of the car and trying to remember how to get it out of neutral and into first gear. This might sound silly, but I hadn't done this since I actually bought the car almost 2 years ago. Me and Dave did it at the guy's place just to make sure everything was working, but I haven't had a chance to test it, the clutch, or anything else since then. As the rest of my group lined up, I put on my helmet and hands device, tightening it and the harnesses up. After all of the other cars entered the track, finally it was my turn to drive this thing for the very first time. Before we proceed, 2 things. Firstly, Andy followed my instructions by pressing the record button on the 360-degree camera, but I didn't give him enough detail on what to look for to make sure it was working. It wasn't recording, and as a result, no 360-degree footage. But that's okay, right? Because I have a second camera system that I had previously checked to make sure it was working. Well, that decided it didn't want to work for the main camera feed at least. If I'd had more runs, we would have worked out what went wrong and would have had plenty of footage for the rest of the day. Secondly, my mindset at this point. I am absolutely petrified of crashing this car. Not so much for my personal safety. I've got a lot of faith in the safety systems built into the car, more in doing damage that's hard to repair. I've put a lot of time and money into this car so far, and I don't really have many spares. So a small off and some minor damage could have major consequences. Because of that, I was absolutely terrified of spinning the car on cold slicks or making any other mistakes that would compromise the vehicle. Honestly, I'd just be happy to get to the end of the day without any damage, even if it meant I was driving really slowly. The idea was to always run last in a group on track, so I could just potter around without holding anyone up. But this was my first time ever driving the car, and unfortunately I stalled. I was already extremely nervous, so this just made things worse. The marshal was really patient, however, and let me know when there was a big gap coming so I could finally join the track. Unfortunately, I was no longer at the back of the pack, and I was indeed holding people up on my outlap. I didn't have the mirrors fully adjusted yet, so I didn't actually realise how bad this was until afterwards when I saw this footage. On this outlap, my sensors were completely saturated. I was so overwhelmed trying to take everything in. I was also petrified of spinning on cold slicks. I short shifted down the front straight to start my first flying lap, and the car sounded pretty good. As I came out of turn 1, that's where the photographer grabbed this series of photos, one of which you saw in the thumbnail. And if anyone from the Western Sydney Wanderers is watching, you should sponsor the car since I'm giving you such great exposure. Obviously for the next part, I don't have any footage to show exactly what happened, so I've had to get creative in order to describe it. For the first time lap, I was pushing a little more than the outlap, but still driving the car way easier than I had on the sim. As I exited the first left-hand hairpin, the car suddenly snapped to the side and sent me onto the grass. I guess I caught it because I didn't end up facing backwards. The grass was damp and I ended up getting stranded on the exit of the turn 2 right-hand hairpin. We can revisit the incident using the telemetry from the AIM 2 and looking at the pedal cam. As you can see, I hit just over 140 km an hour on the straight and then jumped on the brakes early and gently for turn 1. As I said, I was still taking everything very easy. Apart from a few seconds on the straight, I still hadn't used full throttle exiting any of the corners. From here, I'll let it play with sound, but pay attention to my right foot, very gingerly pressing the throttle and not even getting the whole way down when the car snaps. I tried to keep it gently rolling through the grass, but as I said, it was damp and I was soon stranded. At this point, myself and probably everyone else thought I had just spun on my first trip out. The other cars emptied the track and I had to wait for the tow truck to come and get me off the grass. At this point, I noted that the steering wheel was in a boot loop as if the power was being momentarily cut and then it was restarting. The staff towed me backwards and onto the track and instructed me to do a half donut to turn around and keep going. But possibly related to the steering wheel cutting out, I couldn't engage first gear and therefore I was still stranded. After I explained this to them, two of the staff decided to push my car around and backwards into the pits. They were then joined by the photographer. All I can say is that they were a bunch of legends and give my thanks. Oh, and apologise to everyone else in my group for having the session interrupted. It was during this time that the staff noticed the damage to the car and what I assume was the cause of the off.
Oh, that makes sense.
Oh, your axle broke, dude.
Yeah. Oh.
Yeah. Broken axle.
As they pushed the car up the hill, it sounded like they were starting to regret their decision, despite the car being light. But I'm thankful they did get me back to the pits in one piece, where I could roll back to my slot and then assess the damage. I did do some free lawn mowing for them, so at least they got that in return, but as we go down the car, we can ignore the grass and get to the more important thing, the sheared right rear drive shaft. The spline is snapped off as it enters the CV. The car had been sitting for 5 years before I bought it, and it doesn't look like there's a great deal of grease in there, so it's possible that something bound up and then snapped under load. I'm just grateful that it didn't happen on the entry to the straight where I would have smashed into the wall. I then noticed that the front wing was extremely crooked and the fiberglass had split where it had previously been repaired. With no spares of either part, all I could do was call it a day. Andy and I spent a bit of time watching some of the other cars go around, but ultimately there was only so long I wanted to hang around, frustrated by the fact that my first time on track lasted a lap and a half or approximately 2 minutes. I guess that's motor racing, and it really could have been much worse. Imagine if that had snapped coming onto the front straight and put me off sideways into the wall. Obviously, I'm keen to get back on track and do it properly this time, so where to from here? The nose cone actually looks straight and in one piece, but after we unbolt it from the actual front wing, we can see that's in not very good shape. You can see on the left where the impact has punched the metal brackets and split the fiberglass wide open. This is the exact same place that had previously been professionally repaired by a fiberglasser, but all is not lost. You might remember me previously showing this image of a sister car to mine. It's owned by Greg Tebble and it's being converted for hill climb, which means massive custom front and rear wings. It turns out that Greg still has the original front wing sitting in storage doing nothing, so we're currently measuring it up to see if I can purchase it and fit it to my car for a straightforward repair. As for the broken drive shaft, well, it turns out Greg just broke one on his car as well, so he has been kind enough to forward to me all of the specifications and details so I can have a replacement as well as some spares made up. But my first job will be pulling apart all of the broken parts to check the dimensions. Since owning this car, it's definitely been a case of not what I know, but who I know, and I'm extremely appreciative to those that have helped along the way. Obviously, Andy, Matt, and David have been fantastic so far in getting the car ready for the track. And Greg Tebble, owner of the sister car, has not only been generous in his time in helping me prep for this track day, but as you saw, in also helping me find replacement parts. And a thank you too to Greg from the Formula Race Car Association for helping me find a machine shop near me to make the new drive shafts. Moving forward, my plan was to make my next video on buying a new set of tyres and interviewing the people at the tyre shop, just like I did when I was buying the safety gear. I was also planning a video tour of my sim rig, as that's been requested a few times. Both of those videos will still be in future, but I guess the next thing you'll see is some sort of repair video as I get this thing back to drivable condition. So you might be wondering, what happens with this project if I run out of budget? Well, a wise but admittedly biased person recently told me that you can sleep in your car, but you can't drive your house. So I think that means I have to buy more race cars just to look after my family.